What's up everyone, Darcblade here with another Hunter's Guide to Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. In this video we're going to be showing you some full set budget builds, this time for the Gunlance. Now what is a full set budget build? Well, it's a build constructed from one armor set. Whilst it uses different weapons and talismans from different monsters, the main armor set is farmed simply from one monster to minimise farming and is normally strong enough to get you through the story of Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. Now before we get into this, a reminder that if you find these builds helpful, please consider leaving a like on the video as well as subscribing to the channel as we try to bring you a variety of builds for a variety of ways to play. When it comes to the Gunlance, it's in a strong place in Sunbreak. With the new Wirebug and Silkbind additions it has, it's got a lot going for it, but on the surface it's still quite a strong defensive weapon. With one of the biggest shields in the game, it's able to block incoming monster attacks quite effectively, whilst at the same time being able to deal fixed damage thanks to its shelling attacks. It used to have mobility options, but thanks to the new switch skills, this is kind of alleviated and makes it a lot more enjoyable to play. Now the budget builds that I'll be showing off here kind of highlight all these aspects. They highlight how strong the shelling attacks can be, as well as how defensive the weapon can be, combined with quality of life skills. These should give you two builds strong enough to get you through Sunbreak. So the first build I like to refer to as the defensive full set budget build, or if you want a more colourful name, the Pisarios build. This build gives you a strong defense, combined with damage over time and increased shelling attacks. So for this build you'll need the full Pisarios set, which includes the Pisarios Helm X, Mel X, Van Braces X, Coil X and Greaves X. For your Petalace, this is down to personal preference. I tend to say go with the absolute Petalace for the added health, but it's your choice. And then as for your talisman, you'll want to go for a talisman that can get at least weakness exploit to level 2, either via the skills on the talisman itself or via the decoration slots. The rest of the talisman is up to you, depending on what you have available to you. As for the weapon, I'm using the Great Ortlinde, which is the Rathian Gunlance. There's a few reasons why we are taking this, which is it has decent raw attack, it has okay sharpness, it's not the best but it's okay, it has a decent poison rating, allowing us to deal some nice damage over time to a monster, but once it's maxed out it will give us level 8 normal shells. Now a reminder, you may not have the Rathian Gunlance to the same level as I am shown in this video, but regardless, even if you're using the Rathian Gunlance at a lower level, you should still have similar results. Finally, as for the Rampage skill, I've simply gone for a Spirit Bird doubled Rampage bonus, but again, this is another optional choice, it's not essential. So when it comes to the decorations, you've got a few to play around with. First of all, I've gone for Tenderizer Jaws to max out weakness exploit, I've then gone for Venom Jaws to max out poison attack, Artillery Jaws to max out the artillery skill, Brace Jaws to max out flinch free, Jumping Jaws to put a few points in evade extender, a critical jaw for at least 1 point in crit boost, and then finally a shield jaw which is optional for a point in guard up. So if you've done what I've done here, you have a build with a raw attack of 350 with a poison rating of 49. You also have white sharpness with 0% affinity, which can be potentially 90% when you take into account both weakness exploit and latent power. And you'll have a very strong defense of 776 that is strong against ice, thunder and fire, but unfortunately weak to water and especially dragon. As for the switch skills, these are down to personal preference, although charged shelling doesn't really work well with this build and I would instead advise taking Blast Dash. So as for the skills, first of all you'll have Defense Boost at level 7. Defense Boost is a skill that increases our overall armor defense as well as elemental resistances. You'll then have Guard at level 5, increasing how effectively we can block monster attacks, reducing the knockback from those said attacks as well as reducing the stamina depletion as well. You'll then have Latent Power at level 4, a byproduct of the armor we are wearing, but it is still kind of useful. Basically, Latent Power is a skill that kicks in whenever we've been fighting a monster for a set amount of time or we've taken a certain amount of damage from a monster. When that happens, Latent Power will activate, giving us an increase to our affinity as well as reducing our stamina depletion. It's an okay skill, but it's hard to activate. You'll then have Weakness Exploit at level 3. Weakness Exploit is a skill that increases our affinity whenever we're attacking monster weak points. Weakness Exploit at level 3 can potentially provide us a bonus 50% affinity so long as we're aiming our attacks. You'll then have Poison Attack at level 3, increasing the poison rating and build-up of the ailment. Basically, poison weapons allows you to poison monsters, which deals a certain amount of damage over time. This unseen damage can rack up, and on top of that, rarely is a monster completely immune to poison, making this a very useful element to go through the game with. You'll then have artillery at level 3, increasing the damage of our shelling attacks as well as reducing the cooldown of our wyvern's fire. You'll then have load shells at level 2. Load shells is a essential quality of life skill for the Gunlance that increases the Gunlance ammo capacity. You'll then have speed sharpening at level 3, increasing how quickly we can sharpen our weapon and regain our maximum white sharpness. You'll then have flinch free at level 3, which is an optional skill and result of the decorations that prevents knockbacks and tripping on our hunter from not only monsters but also our allies. You'll then have reload speed at level 2. This isn't really needed on the Gunlance whatsoever. It's a bowgun and bow skill that increases how quickly you can reload those weapons. You'll then have Evade Extender at level 2, which is another quality of life, an optional skill that is provided through the decorations. Basically, it increases the distance at which we can evade and dodge, which helps counter the Gunlance's slow mobility and avoid incoming attacks. If we're not comfortable blocking an attack, then Evade Extender will save our butt. You'll also have critical boost at level 1. It would have been nice to get this higher, but still at level 1 it provides a substantial damage bonus, as whenever we crit a monster, those critical attacks will deal increased damage. But a reminder that when it comes to the Gunlance, the shelling attacks, they cannot crit. They deal pretty much fixed damage based off our attack, so shelling attacks get no benefit from crit boost or other affinity based skills. Only our slashing and poking attacks do. And then finally you'll have guard up at level 1, which again is another optional skill. You can drop this if you want for something else, but guard up allows us to block unblockable attacks as well as reduce the damage taken from blocking those said attacks. So as you can see, it's quite a strong defensive build with DPS skills scattered in there. But every build out there has pros and cons. No build is absolutely perfect. When it comes to this build, its biggest pro is its survivability. Having high defense combined with guard, points in evade extender and even guard up, it means we're able to survive against the toughest monsters. On top of that, despite not having the more traditional DPS skills, this build is still able to deal a decent amount of damage thanks to having latent power, weakness exploit, poison attack, artillery and a few other skills. It means we're able to take on monsters fairly comfortably. And finally, when it comes to the pros, this build is fairly easy to build and craft. It doesn't really require any of the super rare decorations or anything like that, so you can get your hands on it quite early in the game if you feel you need it. But of course there are cons. One of the biggest cons for this build is, unfortunately, there are times where sharpness may be an issue. As we have no skills like protected polish, it means that we can burn through the white sharpness fairly quickly, unfortunately. And the other con is, unfortunately, this build does lack Wirebug Whisperer at level 3, which means that we can't utilise the incredibly powerful Wirebug moves that the Gunlance has available to it in Sunbreak as often as we may like. But regardless, this is still a strong full set budget build, and I recommend it for anyone who's looking for an early set to craft when going through Sunbreak. But there's always more than one build. And when it comes to the Gunlance, there is an armor set, a rarity 9 armor set this time, that suits it perfectly. And for the second build, I'm referring to it as the Basilgeuse build. This uses the full Basilgeuse set to give you a very strong all-round build, able to take on most monsters. So for this you'll need the full Basilgeuse set, which includes the Basilgeuse Helm X, Mel X, Braces X, Coil X and Greaves X. For your Petalace, this is down to personal preference, so I've gone for Absolute Petalace. And then for your Talisman, you'll need to get a Talisman that has maxed out Wirebug Whisperer on it, whether that's via the skills on it or decorations, as well as potentially Evade Extender. Evade Extender though is optional, you don't have to go for this if you don't want to. As for my weapon, I'm using the Torchid Lavater, which is the Heya Hunters Gunlance. Remember, as shown here, it's at its absolute maximum level. The only difference at a lower level is that you may not be able to reach that purple sharpness, instead you'll have a huge chunk of white sharpness instead. But you'll still have a very similar outcome even if you're using a lower level Gunlance. As for the Rampage skill, go with one of the anti-species decorations, like Anti-Dragon to give you Wyvern Exploit or something like that. So as for the decorations, first of all I've gone for Handicraft Jaws. Now this is an optional jaw, I've really only taken this to get us to purple sharpness. You may be able to replace this with something else, especially if you are using a lower level version of this specific Gunlance. I've then gone for Grinder Jaws to max out speed sharpening, Sharp Jaws to max out protective polish, Brace Jaws to max out flinch free, which is optional to be fair, Tenderizer Jaws to max out weakness exploit, a critical jaw for a point in crit boost, and then finally a jumping jaw for a few points in the evade extender skill. So if you've done what I've done here, you have a build with a raw attack of 330 with 50 blast rating. You also have either a large chunk of white or a smidgen of purple sharpness, and you'll have 30% base affinity, which can be 80% when you take into account weakness exploit. This can be increased even further to 95% when agitator kicks in. You'll also have either level 7 or level 8 normal shelling types, and you'll have a strong defense of 741 that is strong against fire and water, but unfortunately weak against the other elements, especially thunder. Once again, when it comes to the switch skills, these are down to personal preference, but I will advise going for the blast dash again. So when it comes to the skills, first of all, you'll have Agitator at level 5. Agitator is a skill that kicks in whenever a monster becomes enraged. When this happens, it increases our raw attack as well as our base affinity. You'll then have Guard at level 5, greatly reducing the knockback when we block an attack from a monster, as well as reducing the stamina cost to block those said attacks. You'll then have Weakness Exploit at level 3, increasing our affinity whenever we're attacking monster weak points up to 50%. You'll then have Razor Sharp at level 3, which is a useful skill that prevents your weapon from losing sharpness 50% of the time. You'll then have Guard Up at level 3, allowing us to block unblockable attacks, as well as reducing or severely reducing the actual damage for blocking those said attacks. You'll then have Artillery at level 3, increasing the damage of our shelling attacks, as well as reducing the cooldown of the Wyvern's Fire. You'll then have Speed Sharpening at level 3, which increases how quickly we can sharpen our weapon, getting that purple sharpness back. You'll then have Wirebug Whisperer at level 3, which is a skill useful for the Gunlance to allow us to use those powerful Wirebug and Silkbind moves it has, as it reduces the cooldown rate of Wirebugs we hold, as well as how long we can hold additional Wirebugs as well. You'll then have Protected Polish at level 2. It would have been nice to get this higher in all honesty, but Protected Polish at level 2 is still useful, as it allows us to put a protective coating over our sharpness gauge, preventing any sharpness loss for a small duration of time. I've really only gone for level 2 of this as I wanted points elsewhere, and this combined with Razor Sharp and Speed Sharpening normally means that we don't really have to worry about our sharpness too much. You'll then have Load Shells at level 2, increasing our ammo capacity with the Gunlance. You'll also have Evade Extender at level 2, an optional result of our decorations, increasing the distance at which we can hop, dodge and evade. You'll then have Critical Boost at level 1. It would have been nice to get this higher again, but level 1 is still quite a potent buff as it increases the damage of our attacks, well, our slicing and poking attacks at least, not the shelling attacks. You'll then have Handicraft at level 1, which we've taken really here to get to purple sharpness. Remember that if you're going through the game for the first time and you have a lower Gunlance, you may not need this skill whatsoever. You'll then have Flinch Free at level 1, which prevents minor knockbacks from monsters and especially our allies. And then finally you'll have Master Mounter at level 1, which is a byproduct of the talisman you're using, which makes filling the riding gauge easier and increases the ease of parrying when you're wyvern riding. So there you have it, that is the Basilgeuse set. As you can see, it's again a mix of defensive, quality of life and offensive skills, but even this has pros and cons. When it comes to its pros, one of its biggest is it has decent damage output. Artillery combined with the other DPS skills like Weakness Exploit, Agitator and more means we're able to take down monsters relatively quickly. On top of that, this build is also decent when it comes to survivability. Thanks to having Guard, Guard Up and Evade Extender, we're able to survive even the toughest hunts quite comfortably. And then finally for the pros is that this build has quite a few sharpness management skills. From Razor Sharp, Speed Sharpening and even the few points we have in Protected Polish, rarely should we burn through our sharpness gauge super quickly to the point we have to worry about it. But of course there are cons. One of the biggest cons is that unfortunately you do need a fairly decent talisman for this build to work properly. This is because we will be using our Wirebug and Silkbind attacks quite often, so we need them to come off cooldown. And the Wirebug Whisperer being found on our talisman is the key that allows us to do this. I guess in some respects you could replace the talisman with a talisman that has a lot of weakness exploit on and replace those tenderizer jewels with Wirebug jewels, but this is still something to be aware of. And the other con is that unfortunately, even though our sharpness gauge and sharpness management isn't much of an issue, unfortunately if you're going through the game for the first time you may not have purple sharpness and instead only have a chunk of white sharpness. So again, that's a con that you may need to be aware of. But regardless, if you're looking for a Gunlance build to take on the endgame activities of Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak and finish up the story, then I can definitely recommend this build. And remember, with all of these builds shown in this series, they are not concrete builds. You can change them up to what you fancy, what suits your personal preference. If there's a skill that you specifically always like to use, then you can always add it to these builds if you want. which in all honesty is one of the reasons that makes Monster Hunter builds so great. There's always room for improvement and changes to suit your fancy. But what are your thoughts? Please leave a comment down below, and until next time, I've been Darcblade, bringing you a hunter's guide to some 4-set budget builds for the Gunlance in Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more.